In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And one man who'll tell you the first thing you learn marching beside the damned: they smell wrong. Stand next to a traitor marine, and every animal thing in your skull starts howling, "Leave." But leaving was never one of your options. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from Ossten Grael, 3 years and 7 months, the property of the Pallbearers warband. He was a corporal once, garrison duty. A world so dull, the worst thing that ever happened was a rock slide. He'd give anything to be that bored again. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin.
The first thing you learn when you march beside the damned is that they smell wrong, not like death. I have been around death my whole life, and death has a clean logic to it. Meat rots, blood dries, bone endures. That is the order of things. No, the traitor marines smell like something that should not exist, like heat coming off metal that has never been forged. Like the air before a chemical fire, when your lungs know to run before your legs do. You stand next to one of them and your body starts screaming at you in a language older than words. Every nerve, every reflex, every animal thing buried in the back of your skull begins howling. Leave, leave, leave. But you do not leave, because leaving is not one of your options. My name is Ossten Grael, and I have been property of the Pallbearers warband for 3 years, 7 months, and what I believe to be 11 days. I say believe because time does not work properly out here. Clocks stutter. The stars move wrong. The warp does that to the places the warband visits. It softens things, loosens the joints of reality, until everything sags a little, like a house built on wet ground. You get used to it. Or you go mad. The distinction between the two is less clear than you might imagine. I was a corporal, Kallenthi, 206th Line Infantry, garrison regiment. Nothing glorious, nothing worth writing about. We held walls, we manned checkpoints, we counted convoys through mountain passes on a world so boring that the most exciting thing that happened in my first 6 years of service was a rock slide that killed 2 men in 3rd Platoon. That was Kallenthi for you. Cold wind, gray stone, and the kind of silence that makes you forget there is a war happening anywhere at all. Then Drussenvoll. I will not dwell on it. The regiment was redeployed to a fortress world on the edge of the Pallbearers subsector, and within 4 months a warp storm swallowed the system whole. Reinforcements could not reach us. Astropathic signals went dark. We sat in our fortifications and listened to the Vox crackle with nothing day after day, while the sky turned the color of a bruise and stayed that way. The Pallbearers came on the 39th day, 3 strike cruisers emerging from the warp like splinters pushing through skin. They did not hail us. They did not demand surrender. They simply began landing troops on the northern plateau, and Colonel Hassler called a general assembly and laid it out the way an officer lays things out when he already knows the answer. We could fight, and every one of us would die slowly and in ways that would make the God Emperor weep. Or we could kneel. He knelt first, put his knees in the mud and lowered his head, and I watched 1,200 soldiers watch their commanding officer submit to damnation. Some fought. I will not pretend otherwise. Lieutenant Osservan drew her sidearm and put a bolt through Hassler's adjutant before a squad of our own men dragged her down. Trooper Kennick ran for the walls. He made it about 40 meters before something came out of the ground and pulled him under. I do not know what it was. I did not look closely. The rest of us knelt, not because we believed, not because we wanted to, because the math was simple and the answer was ugly, and the only people with the courage to resist were already dead. That was 3 years ago. The warband is led by a being called Vortigris. I use the word being because lord or commander does not capture what he is. He is ancient. The other Marines do not speak his age aloud, but I have gathered enough to know he walked the soil of Terra before the heresy. His armor is the deep green of something drowned, trimmed in brass that seems to move if you look too long. His face is bare. That is the part that stays with me. Most traitor Marines wear helms, and you are grateful for it, because the ceramite is a layer between you and whatever is left of their expressions. Vortigris does not. His face is a ruin of old scars, and something like bone pushing through the skin above his left eye, his mouth always slightly open, like a man on the edge of saying something he has considered for a very long time. His eyes are the worst, not because they glow or pulse with warp energy. They are just calm, patient. The eyes of something that has watched civilizations rise and crumble, and rise again, and does not feel strongly about any of it. He does not speak to humans. In 3 years I have heard his voice exactly once, and it was not directed at me, but I was close enough that the sound went through my chest like a subsonic detonation. I tasted copper for an hour. The Astartes vocal cords were built to command battlefields, but 10 millennia of the warp working on those cords produces something that is not simply loud. It is wrong in the same way they smell wrong. It resonates in places inside you that should not have resonance. Vortigris commands through his chosen, 7 of them, each a traitor Marine of appalling capability and deep devotion to the warband's cause. They relay his will to the lesser Marines, who relay it to the cult leaders, who relay it to us, the humans, the mortals, the meat that fills the gaps between the gods. There are roughly 400 of us at any given time. The Pallbearers do not simply use cultists. They absorb Imperial forces, defectors and prisoners, and broken regiments. The Kallenthi, 206th, was not the first and will not be the last. We are organized loosely along Imperial lines because that is what we know, answering to a man named Brevin Thul, who was a sergeant major in some regiment I never learned the name of, and has been with the warband longer than anyone else I have met. Thul lost his left eye and most of his left ear in a boarding action 6 years ago, and the wound healed wrong, the flesh knitting into a smooth, waxy surface that gleams like scar tissue but has no pores and does not feel like skin. He does not talk about it. None of us talk about the changes. The changes. That is the word we use, those of us who still have enough of ourselves left to notice, because they happen. Slowly at first, so slowly you can pretend they are not happening at all. A tooth comes in sharper than it should. A bruise heals in a day instead of a week. You wake up one morning and your fingernails are thicker than they were, and the edges are harder, and if you drag one across metal, it leaves a mark. Small things. Things you can file down or cover up or simply refuse to look at. It is the warp. We live in its wake. We sleep in ships whose Geller fields have decayed into blasphemies that hold back the worst of the immaterium and let the rest leak in. We breathe air recycled by systems maintained by things that are not entirely mechanical anymore. We fight on worlds where the warp bleeds through the soil like groundwater, where the sky is the wrong color and the shadows do not match the objects casting them. It gets into you, not like a disease, like a stain, like ink dropped into water. It spreads through everything you are, and it does not stop. And after a while, you cannot tell where you end and it begins. I noticed my first change 7 weeks after Drassenvol. A mole on my left forearm that had been there since childhood moved, not grew, not changed color, moved. It was on the underside of my wrist when I went to sleep and on the back of my hand when I woke up, about 3 centimeters from where it started, as if it had crawled there in the night. I stared at it for a long time. Then I put my sleeve down and went to morning muster and never mentioned it to anyone. Tove Rannick was the one who told me the rules. Tove was Kallenthi 206th, same as me, though I did not know him well before the turn. He was second company, a rifleman of no particular distinction, thin and angular with a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts. Sharp nose, crooked jaw, eyes set at slightly different heights. An ugly man, but clever in the way that ugly men often are, because the world does not hand them anything for free. We will live longer if we are useful, Tove told me on the transport out of the Drassenvol system, packed into a hold that reeked of old blood and machine oil. He said it matter-of-factly, the way you might note that it will rain tomorrow. The ones who are useful get fed. The ones who are not get used up. Simple as that. He was right. The Pallbearers operate on a brutal economy of utility. If you can fight, navigate, decode, pilot, perform field surgery, or do anything that saves a traitor marine the effort of doing it himself, you have value. And value gets you maintained, fed, armed, a place to sleep with walls and a door and something approximating heat. Not well, not comfortably, but enough. The ones with no skills die quickly, not always in battle. Sometimes they are simply taken. A Chaos Marine strides through the human quarters with purpose, points at someone, and that someone is gone. Taken to the lower decks, to the ritual chambers. We do not talk about what happens down there, but sometimes during the night cycle, you hear the screaming, and it goes on far longer than a human body should be able to scream. I had skills, demolitions training, field engineering, competent marksmanship. Nothing exceptional by Imperial standards, but among the human auxiliaries of a Chaos warband, competence is currency more valuable than faith. An Astartes in Terminator plate does not need a demolitions charge to breach a wall, but the Marines are few, and the galaxy is vast, and there are 1,000 small tasks in any campaign that are beneath a demigod's attention but still need doing. We are the hands that do the work too small for gods to notice. Tove and I fell into a rhythm in those first months. You learn the pattern quickly because the pattern is the only thing keeping you alive. Wake when the klaxons sound. Report to muster. Receive your assignment. Execute. Return. Eat what is provided. Sleep. Do not ask questions. Do not look at the Astartes unless they are looking at you. Do not enter the shrine decks. Do not touch anything with the 8-pointed star unless you are told to. Do not resist the changes. But patterns only hold when the universe cooperates, and the universe does not cooperate on a Chaos warship. The Pallbearers' primary vessel was a battle barge called the Veligast. Its bones were imperial. You could tell from the architecture and the ghost outlines on the walls, where Aquilus had been chiseled away and replaced with devotional markings that shifted when you turned your back. But 10,000 years in the eye of terror changes a ship the way the warp changes everything. The metal of the hull was warm, not from engine heat. Warm the way living skin is warm, and if you pressed your palm to a bulkhead and held it there, you could feel a pulse, slow and deep and irregular, like the heartbeat of something immense dreaming underneath you. The human quarters were on decks 14 through 16. Above us, the Marines. Below us, the lower decks. We had bunks, a mess hall converted from a munitions store, and a washroom that produced water in 3 states: cold, scalding, and a third temperature I cannot describe because it was not hot or cold, but left your skin numb for hours. You learned to use the cold. The corridors were the worst part. To get anywhere, you moved through shared space, and shared space meant proximity to the Marines. You would hear it before you felt it, the heavy clang of ceramite boots, each footstep carrying the weight of a being that massed 3 times what a man does. You press yourself against the wall. Everyone does. And the Marine passes, the corridor shaking with each step, the air displacing around him in a bow wave you feel against your chest, and the smell hits you, and you catch a glimpse. A pauldron the size of your torso, a fist that could close around your skull, eyes, if the helm is off, that register your existence the way you might register a smudge on a window. Briefly, without interest. Sometimes they spoke to each other, not in Gothic, in a battle cant that was half vocalization and half something that bypassed the air and went straight into your nervous system. 2 Marines holding a conversation 3 meters from you, and the sound of it making your vision swim. I vomited the first time. Tova dragged me into an alcove and told me to breathe through it, and the Marines walked past without breaking stride. And then there was warp travel. The Velagast's Geller field was a corrupted thing. Shelek told us as much on the first transit, in the flat tone he used for everything. The field generator exists, he said. It does not function as the Imperium intends. The warband prefers it that way. Do not leave your quarters during transit. If you see something in the corridor that should not be there, do not acknowledge it. If it speaks to you, do not answer. If you cannot remember your own name when transit ends, report to me. The first transit lasted 3 days. The engines changed pitch when we entered the immaterium, from mechanical grind to something like a choir singing a single wrong note. The walls breathed, not metaphorically. The metal expanded and contracted in slow undulations, the deck plates shifting underfoot like the hide of something alive. The lights flickered in almost rhythmic patterns, and if you watched too long, you began to see shapes in the intervals, faces or hands or things that were neither, pressing against the other side of reality. Something walked past my bunk 2 hours into the transit. I did not see it. I heard it. Footsteps with too many impacts per stride, as if whatever walked had more legs than the corridor had width, and a smell of wet stone and old blood, and a sweetness like overripe fruit. It paused outside my bunk. I felt its attention the way you feel sunlight on the back of your neck, a curiosity with nothing human in it. I did not acknowledge it. I lay still and breathed, and after a time that might have been seconds or hours, it moved on, and I did not sleep for the rest of the transit. That last rule is the one that kills people, not directly, but the ones who fight the corruption, who pray to the Emperor in secret and scratch Aquiles into their bunks. They break first, not because the warp punishes defiance. It does not care about defiance. Because holding on to what you were takes energy, and you do not have enough of it on half rations and 4 hours of sleep in the company of the damned. The ones who resist burn through themselves. They get thin, hollow. Their hands start shaking, and one morning they do not get up for muster, and when someone checks, they are sitting in the corner of their bunk, muttering the litany of protection in a voice worn down to a whisper. Those ones get taken to the lower decks too. So you let go, not all at once, a little at a time. You stop saying the prayers. You stop reaching for the aquila that is no longer around your neck. You stop flinching when the never-born walk past, those half-real things that flicker in and out of existence in the corridors of the warband's ships, all teeth and angles and the sound of laughter coming from somewhere you cannot identify. You stop fighting the dreams. And one morning you wake up and realize that you are not the person who knelt in that courtyard on Drossenvol, and you are not sure who you are instead, but at least you are still breathing. That is the first lesson. Stop being who you were, not because you want to, because the person you were cannot survive this, and survival is the only sacrament that matters in the kingdom of the damned. The second lesson came from Skelek. Shelek was one of Vortigris's chosen, and he was our handler. The word does not do justice to the role. He was the bridge between the traitor Marines and the human auxiliaries, the one who decided which of us went where, who lived and who was spent, who was useful and who was fuel. Every warband that keeps humans has someone like Shelek, a Marine patient enough to manage mortal assets, and patience is not a common virtue among the traitor Astartes. He was tall, even for a space marine. His armor was the deep charcoal of the Pallbearers, marked with devotional script and stained at the joints with something that was not rust, but had a similar color. His helm was ancient, a Mark III pattern filed down to a crest ridge, the eye lenses glowing a sickly amber that pulsed at irregular intervals, like a heartbeat that could not find its rhythm. In 3 years, I never once saw what was under it, but his voice was different from the other Marines. Quieter, measured. He used short, precise sentences and waited for acknowledgement before continuing, with the cadence of an instructor accustomed to making himself understood by beings far beneath him. Shelek assembled the human officers, such as we were, 3 days after we left Drassenvol. 12 of us, the remnants of the 206th command structure, plus a handful of veterans from other absorbed units. He stood before us in a cargo bay with the light falling at wrong angles, because light always falls at wrong angles on a Chaos ship. And he laid out the terms of our existence. You are alive because you are useful. You will remain alive for as long as you remain useful. Usefulness is measured in results, not in faith, not in devotion, not in how loudly you praise the powers that sustain this warband. Results. Kill what you are told to kill. Hold what you are told to hold. Build what you are told to build. Destroy what you are told to destroy. The gods do not care about your feelings. Neither do I. He paused, looked at each of us in turn, those amber lenses sweeping across the line with mechanical precision. Some of you will try to prove your loyalty through zeal, through scarring yourselves, through chanting, through performing rituals you have seen but do not understand. Do not. You are soldiers, not priests. I need soldiers. The warband has priests. They are on the lower decks. You do not want to be on the lower decks? That was the second lesson. The zealots die faster than the pragmatists. I watched a man I will call Drenner, because I have genuinely forgotten his real name, carve the mark of corn into his chest with a combat knife during a planetfall. He was screaming prayers in a language he should not have known, and his eyes had rolled back to show the whites. And he threw himself into the enemy lines with nothing but that knife and his faith. He killed 9 Imperial Guardsmen before a bolter round took his head off. The Marines did not notice. Drenner's death meant nothing to them. He was a single round expended from an infinite magazine. Shelek noticed. Shelek always noticed. And when we regrouped after that engagement, he looked at me and he said, "You are still here." It was not a question. It was not praise. An observation delivered in a tone that carried the faintest trace of something I might have called interest. I nodded because what else do you do when a demigod of ceramite and 10,000 years of hatred acknowledges your continued existence? Good, he said. Do not stop. And I did not. The Pallbearers are not a legion. Not one of the great traitor hosts that marched on Terra 10,000 years ago and shattered the galaxy in half. They are a warband, stitched together from the wreckage of that war and the wars that followed. Vortigris is their core, their anchor, and whatever he was before, whatever legion spawned him, he has shed that identity like dead skin. Their ideology is simple in a way the grander Chaos factions are not. They serve no single god. They take from all 4. Strength from the blood god, resilience from the Lord of Decay, cunning from the architect of fate, sensation from the prince of excess. They worship none and use all, and if that sounds like a contradiction, it is. And the warp does not care about contradictions. The warband numbered perhaps 60 Astartes when I joined them, which is a small number if you are thinking in terms of Imperial chapter strength. But a Chaos Marine is not a Loyalist Marine. They have had 10 millennia to accumulate power, mutations, demonic pacts, and war gear that makes standard Astartes equipment look like children's toys. A single pallbearer in full harness, wreathed in the blessings of the ruinous powers, is worth a squad of loyalists. Or so they tell themselves. I am not in a position to argue. Below the Marines are the possessed. I need to talk about them because they are the thing that humans in the warband fear most, more than the Astartes themselves, more than the demons that flicker through the ship's corridors. The possessed were Marines once. Now they are something else. They invited demons into their flesh, or had demons forced into them, and the result is a fusion of Astartes, physiology, and warp entity that is neither one thing nor the other. They are kept in the deep holds, in chambers sealed with wards and chains and the constant murmuring of bound psychers, because they are not controllable in the way that even the most deranged Chaos Marine is controllable. They are weapons. You point them at the enemy and you get out of the way, and when the killing is done, you hope they stop. Sometimes they do not. I saw a possessed kill 3 of our own during a boarding action on an Imperial frigate. It had been unleashed into the enemy's gun decks, and it tore through the naval armsmen like a threshing machine through grain. But when the armsmen were dead, it kept going, turned on the cultists who had followed it in, who were standing there cheering, and it split the first one from groin to crown with a single downward stroke of an arm that had too many joints. The cheering stopped. The possessed ate part of the second one before Shelek put it down with a melta blast that took off everything below the ribcage. Even then, it crawled. I watched it drag itself across the deck plating, still reaching for the third cultist, who was pressed against a bulkhead with his eyes so wide I could see the veins in them. The possessed made a sound as it died, not a scream, a word. One word in a language that had no right to exist, and the third cultist's nose started bleeding and he did not stop screaming for 2 days. That is the hierarchy. Vortigris at the top, his chosen below him, the line Marines below them, the possessed in their cages, the sorcerers who exist in their own lateral structure and answer to Vortigris alone, the mutants and beastmen who serve as shock troops and menial labor, and at the bottom, us, the humans, the ones who still have 2 arms and 2 legs and a face that mostly resembles what it looked like when we were born. Mostly. I said I would tell you about the changes. The physical part is mechanical, cells dividing wrong, bones thickening, tissue rearranging in patterns no medici would recognize. The hard part is what it does to your sense of self. You look in a mirror, if you can find one that has not been warped, and the face looking back is yours but adjusted. Like someone took your features and shifted them 2 degrees in a direction that does not exist on any compass. And you know in a way that bypasses logic that there is no baseline to return to. The thing in the mirror is not the end state. It is a waypoint on a road that leads somewhere you cannot see and would not want to. Tove handled it better than I did. Tove handled everything better than I did, or at least he made it look that way. Within 6 months of the turn, he had found his niche. Tove was a scrounger, a fixer, a man who could acquire things. Better rations, cleaner water, ammunition that had not been tainted by whatever leaked from the ship's reactor. He built relationships with the mutant clans, the Beastmen Warrens, even some of the lower-ranking Marines who had use for a human that could procure without being told how. He was valuable, and he made sure everyone knew it. and the warband rewarded value with survival. But Tove did something else that I did not do. Tove started believing. Not all at once, not in a blinding moment of conversion. It was incremental, the way all the worst things are. He started attending the shrine gatherings, started listening to the Dark Apostle, a hunched and terrible figure called Velundrin, who preached the unity of the four powers from a pulpit made of fused bone. Started repeating phrases from the sermons when we were alone. The gods see all labor. The gods reward all service. Suffering is the coin of ascension. I asked him once, about 8 months in, whether he actually believed what he was saying or whether it was just another survival strategy, another way to make himself useful. He looked at me with those mismatched eyes, and he said something that I have never been able to shake loose. Does it matter? He was smiling when he said it, that thin, crooked smile. For Tove, the line between real belief and performed belief had stopped mattering. He had found a framework that rewarded him and stepped inside it. Whether it was true was a question for people who had the luxury of philosophy. Tove did not. Neither did I. The difference between us was that I could not stop noticing. Our first real campaign came 4 months after Drassenvol. The warband descended on a world called Athus Noval, a mid-tier hive world in the Pallbearers subsector, the same subsector my old regiment had been garrisoned to defend. The irony was not lost on me. Athus Noval had a population of roughly 800 million and a planetary defense force of moderate capability, and it had the misfortune of sitting on a supply corridor that Vortigris wanted to control. I will not describe the campaign in full because war, even the war of the damned, is mostly waiting, punctuated by bursts of incomprehensible violence. What I will tell you is what it felt like to be on the wrong side of an Imperial defensive line for the first time. We went in as the forward screen. 200 human auxiliaries, mixed units, some from the 206th but mostly cultists, and absorbed prisoners from half a dozen other conquests. Our job was to probe the outer Hab district defenses, draw fire, and identify strong points for the Marines to crack. It was textbook Imperial Guard tactics, the exact doctrine I had been trained in. Except now I was the one being spent. The PDF defenders were dug into a residential district on the southern edge of Hive Primus. Good positions, overlapping fields of fire, razor wire, and tank traps, and all the things you put in front of yourself when you know something terrible is coming. I could read their setup like a language I had spoken my whole life. I knew where the heavy weapons teams would be. I knew where the kill zones overlapped. I knew because I had been trained to build exactly this kind of defense, how to take it apart. And that is what I did. Shelek had given me a squad of 12 and told me to find a way through the southern approach, and I found one. A drainage culvert that ran beneath the main defensive line, wide enough for single file, blocked by a grate that 2 charges would remove. I cannot tell you how I knew the culvert was there. It was not on any schematic we had been given. I had never been to Athus Noval before, but as I studied the defensive layout from our forward position, I felt a pull, a sense of certainty that had no source, like a compass needle swinging toward true north. That way, below the street, past the junction, through the grate, I attributed it to instinct. Every soldier develops a feel for terrain, a subconscious ability to read the landscape and find the gaps. That is what I told myself, and at the time I believed it. I led my squad through the culvert in the dark, the water around our ankles thick with chemical runoff, and something sweeter I chose not to identify. Halfway through, I stopped the column and held up a fist, and 3 seconds later, a grenade detonation shook the ceiling, exactly where we would have been if I had not stopped. A cultist named Drevik asked me afterward how I had known. I said I heard something. I had not heard anything. I had felt the danger the way you feel heat from a fire you have not yet seen, a pressure against the skin of my awareness that had no business being there. We came up behind the PDF command post and killed 14 men in about 90 seconds. They were soldiers, Imperial soldiers, in the same flak armor I had worn on Kallenthi, carrying the same las rifles, praying to the same emperor I once prayed to. One of them, a corporal no more than 19, had a picked capture taped inside her helmet, a woman and a child, and she was reaching for her sidearm when Tove shot her through the throat. I did not feel anything. Not guilt, not satisfaction, not horror, nothing. And the absence frightened me more than any demon ever had, because it meant the slow erosion of everything I used to be had already done its work on the parts that mattered most. We cracked the southern line. The Marines poured through the gap. I had seen them in the corridors, on the ship, at a distance, during planetfall, but I had never seen them fight. Not from close enough to understand what fighting means when a Chaos Space Marine does it. The first one through the breach was a line Marine whose name I never learned. He carried a bolter in one hand, a two-handed weapon wielded like a sidearm, and in the other a running chainsword whose teeth screamed at a pitch that cut through the battle noise. He came through at a speed that should not have been possible for something his size. Not running. Striding, each step covering 2 meters, and the PDF defenders regrouping on the other side did not have time to react. The half-second between recognition and response was all it took for him to kill the first 3. The bolter fired once. A mass reactive round hit a sergeant in the chest, and the man came apart from the sternum up. The chainsword took the next 2 in a single lateral swing, and the sound of it going through flak armor and bone and meat is one I still hear when the ship is quiet. They fired back at him, las guns and a heavy stubber, and the rounds hit his armor and did nothing. Not deflected, nothing. He turned toward the stubber almost casually. The bolter barked twice, and the stubber and the 2 men operating it ceased to exist. 46 defenders in a fortified position. 1 Marine, 20 seconds. When it was over, he stood in the abattoir that had been a command post, tilted his head as if listening, and moved on. Did not check the bodies, did not acknowledge the humans following in his wake with shaking hands. What happened to the position next was beneath his notice. The hive fell in 11 days. Shelek found me after the battle, sitting on a pile of rubble that had been a sholam. I know it had been a sholam because there were small desks in the wreckage, and writing implements, and a blackboard that had survived mostly intact with a lesson about the Emperor's light still chalked on its surface. "You did well," he said. "Thank you," I said. The words came out before I could stop them, and the worst part was that I meant them. Here is the thing about chaos that nobody tells you. It does not storm the gates. It fills the spaces that open up when everything else is taken away. Home, regiment, emperor, right and wrong. Each one leaves a gap, and into each gap trickles a pragmatic little voice that says, "This is how things are now." That voice sounds like your own. That is the trick. Brevin Thule pulled me aside after Athus Noval and told me I was being moved up. Skelek had put my name forward. A permanent command, a platoon of 40, mixed composition. Experienced fighters, Thule said, with a look that suggested experience was a generous description. I would be responsible for the platoon's combat effectiveness and discipline, and for identifying which of my people had begun to break down in ways that compromised their function. I would be the one to report those names. I knew what happened to the names I reported, the lower decks, the ritual chambers, the screaming. I accepted. There was no alternative that did not involve the lower decks myself. Tova was my second in command. He had volunteered for it, had lobbied Thule and probably Shelek too, and when I asked him why, he gave me that crooked smile and said, "Because you are the most dangerous man in this warband, Ossten. You are dangerous because you do not care about anything, and a man who does not care cannot be manipulated." He was wrong about that, about all of it. But it sounded right at the time, and in the kingdom of the damned, sounding right is often enough. I commanded that platoon for the next 2 years. 40 souls at the start. By the end, I had cycled through over 120, replacing the dead and the broken and the taken with whatever warm bodies the warband provided. In the Pallbearers, human lives were a resource with a ledger, and Skelek kept that ledger meticulously. We fought on 11 worlds in those 2 years. Athus Noval was the first. Then Koreth Landing, a naval depot on the edge of the subsector. Koreth Landing is where I learned what boarding action means when you are doing it alongside the traitor Astartes. The warband hit 3 Imperial frigates that were docked for resupply, and my platoon was assigned to the assault on the second ship, a sword-class frigate called, with the Imperium's characteristic lack of imagination, the Emperor's Resolve. We entered through a breach in the port cargo bay that 2 Pallbearer Marines had cut with melta charges. The Marines went first. We went second, climbing through into a passage that had been a functioning corridor 30 seconds earlier and was now twisted metal, shattered deck plating, and the remains of the armsmen who had defended it. The heat still radiated off the walls, and the air was thick with the chemical stink of vaporized hull plating and cooked tissue. The 2 Marines were already 20 meters ahead. A boarding action with Chaos Marines is not a cooperative operation. It is a pursuit. They advance, you try to keep up, and if you fall behind, you are alone in a hostile ship full of defenders who will kill you without the hesitation they show the armored giants. Your job is to hold the ground the Marines have taken and deal with the survivors who emerge in their wake. We pushed deeper. The sound was indescribable. Bolt fire in an enclosed space is a concussive series of detonations that hits your chest like a fist and leaves your ears whining. The Marines fired ahead of us, around a bend, each detonation sending shockwaves back through the passage that rocked us on our feet. I tasted blood. One of my squad, a young cultist whose name I did not know yet, was bleeding from both ears and had not noticed. Then one of the Marines came back through us, not retreating, moving to a new position. He came around the bend at full stride, 3 meters of ceramite, and my platoon was in the corridor, and he did not slow down. He came through us the way a boulder comes through a stream, and 3 of my people went down. Not from an attack, from displacement. He shouldered past them without malice, without awareness, and the casual contact with a being in power armor sent 1 man into the bulkhead hard enough to crack 2 ribs and a woman to the deck plating stunned. The 3rd was less fortunate. The Marine's pauldron caught him across the face as he turned, broke his jaw and his orbital bone, dropped him like a sack of wet grain. The Marine did not pause, did not look back, probably did not feel the contact at all, the way you do not feel the grass you crush walking across a field. I pulled the injured out of the corridor. The man with the broken face survived, though the eye on that side never tracked properly again, and he never complained because complaining about a Marine would be like complaining about the weather. We secured 7 decks of that frigate. I killed a ship's boatswain who begged for his life in a dialect I half recognized from my homeworld. Tove shot 3 armsmen who had surrendered because Shelik's standing orders were clear. No prisoners on boarding actions. The Pallbearers took the ship in 40 minutes, and when it was over, the 2 Marines who had led the assault were already on the boat to the 3rd frigate, not waiting for the humans to finish clearing the ship they had torn apart. Then Pellethis 7, a mining colony where the PDF lasted 2 hours and the warband spent 6 days extracting something from the planet's core that made the air taste like copper. Then Vorengard, a cemetery world, where we fought among the crypts of 10,000 years of Imperial dead, and the sorcerers did something to the graves that made the ground move in ways I will not describe. Pellethis taught me that the warband's wars are not always about territory, that sometimes the objective is beyond human comprehension, and the humans simply endure. Vorengard taught me that the dead are not always dead, but it was the 5th campaign on a world called Thendra that changed things. Thendra was a fortress world, not like Drassenvol, which had been a backwater outpost playing at fortification. Thendra was the real thing. Layered void shields, kilometers of trench networks, orbital defense platforms, and a garrison of 30,000 Imperial Guard drawn from 3 separate regiments. The Pallbearers wanted Thendra because it controlled a stable warp route into the Palindrus subsector's core worlds, and Vortigris was building towards something larger, a campaign that would eventually consume the entire subsector. Thendra was the lock on the door, and we were the key. The assault lasted 3 months. It was the longest sustained operation I had participated in, and it was the closest I came to dying during my time with the warband. Not because of the fighting, though the fighting was brutal. Because of what I discovered. But first, the fighting. Thendra was trench warfare, the old kind, the grind and push that the Imperial Guard excels at, and that Chaos warbands typically bypass with demonic intervention or orbital bombardment. Except the Thendra trenches were protected by void shields that made orbital strikes ineffective, and the garrison's Psyker cadre was strong enough to disrupt the sorcerer's attempts at warp manipulation. So the Pallbearers had to do it the hard way, which meant we had to do it the hard way. The tactic was simple in concept and murderous in execution. Human auxiliaries advance into the trench network, draw fire, identify the strong points, the heavy weapon positions, the kill zones, report back. Then the Marines come through and whatever the humans have not already softened gets broken. On the 3rd day of the main assault, Shelek attached my platoon to a Marine called Gorvel. I mention his name because he is the only Marine besides Shelek who ever used mine. Gorvel was line infantry by the warband standards, which meant he was 700 years old and had killed more human beings than some plagues. His armor was a patchwork of ceramite from at least 3 different patterns, and his right arm below the elbow had been replaced with something that was not a standard augmetic. It moved like flesh but was too long, the fingers had too many joints, and the surface was covered in fine ridges, like fingerprints scaled up to cover a limb. He never explained it. I never asked. My platoon's job was to advance ahead of Gorviel through a section of communication trench designated Sector 12, flush the defenders out of their bunkers, and channel them into his kill zone. We were beaters. The kind of role that dogs serve on a hunt, driving the prey toward the gun. We went in at dawn. 32 of us, moving through a trench barely wide enough for 2 men abreast, the walls reinforced with plastic and sandbags, and the occasional glimpse of bone where the earth had been turned up. The Thendra garrison had dug well, fighting positions every 40 meters, overlapping lanes of fire, grenade sumps. A good defense. I would have been proud of it in another life. We hit the first fighting position and lost 4 people to concentrated lass fire. I pulled the platoon back, sent a flanking element through a side trench, and we took the position in a crossfire and scattered the rest deeper into the network. Standard work. My hands knew the job. Then Gorviel came through. He did not fit in the trench. That is not a figure of speech. The communication trench was designed for normal human proportions, and a Chaos Space Marine in full plate is not normal human proportions. He came through it anyway, his pauldrons scraping both walls simultaneously, gouging furrows in the plastic and the dirt, the sound of ceramite on earth like nails on slate. The trench walls cracked and buckled around him as he passed, and the sandbags split, and the wooden supports groaned, and I realized that the trench was not a trench anymore. It was a corridor, and Gorvael was reshaping it by the simple act of moving through it. The fleeing defenders had regrouped 50 meters ahead, behind a sandbagged strong point with a tripod-mounted autocannon. They saw Gorvael coming, and the autocannon opened up, a sound like a god hammering on an anvil, and the rounds hit Gorvael's chest plate, and I watched the impacts from 10 meters behind him. Sparks, deformation, a crack in the ceramite across his left pectoral that wept something dark. He did not slow down, he did not take cover. He lowered his head slightly, the way a man lowers his head walking into a wind, and he walked into the autocannon fire, each step deliberate. Each impact rocked him back a fraction of a degree before the next carried him forward again. When he reached the strong point, he put his wrong arm through the sandbag wall and through the autocannon and through the man operating it, all in a single motion, the way you might push your hand through a paper screen. He held the dead gunner up on that arm for a moment, impaled through the torso, and he looked at the body the way a craftsman looks at a piece of work he is evaluating. Then he shook it loose and kept moving. I ordered my platoon forward. We followed in his wake, stepping over the debris, the pulped sandbags, the things that had been soldiers. One of my squad leaders, a woman named Pellar, who had joined the warband from a captured transport ship, was shaking so badly she could barely hold her weapon. I put my hand on her shoulder and said nothing because there was nothing to say. You do not comfort someone who has just witnessed a force of nature wearing the shape of a man. You just keep moving. The trench system fell in 6 hours. Gorvael killed 61 defenders by my count, and I was not counting carefully. When it was over and the sector was secured, he stood in the ruins of the command bunker at the end of the trench network and looked at me. Not through me. At me. Those eyes, red-black and ancient, focused on my face the way a lens focuses light. "Grael," he said. "My name," in a voice that vibrated in my ribcage. "You fed them to me well." Then he walked away, and I stood in the trench with the dead and the stink and the knowledge that I had just been complimented by a 700-year-old killer, and the compliment was that I had been a good dog. But the fighting was not what changed things on Thendra. It happened in the 7th week during a lull in the trench warfare. My platoon had rotated to a reserve position behind the main line, dug into the ruins of a supply depot the warband's artillery had leveled. The Marines were 100 meters to our north, in a section of trench they had claimed as their own, and I could see them. What Marines do when they are not fighting is one of those things nobody tells you about, because nobody positioned to observe it usually lives to pass it on. Some maintained their weapons, not the way a guardsman does with a cleaning kit and the standardized motions of the Munitorum manual. A Marine maintaining a bolter treats it as a devotional act. They disassemble it completely, lay the components on a cloth, and speak to it. Low murmurs, half-chants, in languages that predate the Imperium by millennia. They oil the firing mechanism with substances that give off a faint acidic vapor. One was applying a paste to his bolter's barrel, flecked with small dark particles, and I am almost certain the particles were bone. Others did nothing. They simply stood. For hours. A Chaos Space Marine can stand motionless longer than you think possible, metabolism running so far below human baseline that they appear dead. But they are not dead. They are somewhere else, communing with whatever aspect of the warp they serve. You walk past one and your body knows the stillness is wrong, that nothing alive should be that still, and the animal part of your brain registers it as a threat, the way it would a coiled serpent. Gorviel was sharpening his chainsword, not with a whetstone, with his bare hand, the wrong one, the one with too many joints. He drew his palm along the length of the blade, and the friction between his ridged skin and the adamantine teeth made a sound high and thin and musical, like a wet finger on the rim of a glass. And wherever his hand passed, the metal shifted from dull gray to something blacker, as if his touch was feeding something into it. He did this for 3 hours and did not look up once. When he finished, the chainsword hummed at a lower, hungrier pitch, and the air around it bent in a subtle concavity, as if the blade was pulling the world toward itself. I watched all of this from the supply depot while my platoon rested. They did not tire. They did not sleep, not as we understood it. They shifted from killing to waiting to killing again, seamless and inhuman, and it reminded you every time that you were not serving alongside soldiers. You were serving alongside weapons that had been given consciousness and the ability to look at you with 10,000-year-old eyes and find you insufficient. I went back to sorting through salvaged Imperial supplies, looking for anything usable. The supply depot had serviced the Thendra garrison. Everything in it belonged to the 3 Imperial Guard regiments stationed here: the Thendra 5th Fortress Infantry, the Thendra 9th, and an artillery formation I did not bother to identify. Their supply crates were standard Departamento Munitorum issue, plastic shells with regimental stenciling and inventory seals. Nothing unusual. I was cracking them open one by one, looking for rations and medical supplies, working through the routine the way you do when your hands know the job and your mind is somewhere else. I opened a crate of rations belonging to the Thendra 5th, compressed nutrient bars, protein slabs, vitamin supplements, standard garrison fare, the same bland, compressed nutrition that every Lina infantry regiment in the Imperium eats 3 times a day. I picked up a nutrient bar, turned it over out of habit, and stopped. On the underside of the packaging, very small, almost invisible, unless the light caught it at the right angle, was a secondary stamp, a symbol, not the Munitorum Aquila, not a subcontractor mark. A geometric design, an arrangement of interlocking lines that formed something between a sigil and a schematic, and I had seen it before. I had seen it on the nutrient bars I ate on Kallenthi, the same stamp, identical. On Kallenthi I had noticed it once or twice in the idle way that soldiers notice the markings on their equipment, and assumed it was a batch identifier from some Munitorum contractor, a detail that means nothing. But the Thendra 5th did not eat rations from the same contractor as the Kallenthi 206th. They could not have. Different subsectors, different logistics networks, different procurement authorities. The same stamp had no reason to be on both. I went through the rest of the crate. Every package bore the mark. I opened a second crate, also Thendra 5th, same stamp. A third marked for the 9th. Same. I stood there with nutrient bars spread across a broken table and the quiet certainty that I had found something that was not meant to be found. I showed the stamp to Tova, explained what I remembered from Kallenthi. He looked at the ration package for a long time, turning it over and over in his thin fingers. And then he looked at me and his face was doing something I had never seen before. Tovo, who always had an angle, who always had the crooked smile and the easy answer, looked genuinely unsettled. "I have seen that symbol," he said. His voice was low, flat, not in ration packaging, in a manifest, on the ship. I run salvage for one of the marine armorers. It puts me in the lower storage bays where no other human is allowed, and the patrols have stopped paying me any attention. 3 months ago, I found a set of records that were not meant for human eyes. Ledger entries, dozens of them, listing worlds and regiment designations and dates. Each entry had that symbol next to it, and next to the symbol a word I did not understand. What word? Cultivation. He said it like it tasted bad. Then he said, "Do not pull on this thread, Ossten." That was the wrong thing to say. If he had told me it was nothing, I might have believed him, but telling me not to look was the surest way to guarantee that I would. I started paying attention, not searching, not investigating, because investigation requires resources and freedom of movement that a human auxiliary does not have. But paying attention, watching, listening, the way a soldier watches a tree line, not because he has seen anything, but because his instincts are telling him something is wrong. Over the next 3 weeks, I found more. Not supply crates, something worse. I found a personnel file, paper, actual physical paper, in the ruins of a Thendra command bunker that my squad had been clearing for the warband's forward operating base. It was a departmental munitorum transfer order, heavily redacted, authorizing the redeployment of the Kallenthi 206th from their homeworld garrison to the Pallbearers subsector. What was not normal was the counter-signature, not from Segmentum Command, not from any authority I recognized. A string of symbols that matched the stamp on the rations, the same symbol Tove had seen in the ledger on the ship. And next to it, in handwriting that was precise and deliberate, and somehow too regular to be human, a single annotation. Cultivation Stage 3. Transition authorized. Stage 3. The manifest Tove had found listed stages 1 through 5. Our regiment was at Stage 3. Now I knew what Stage 3 meant. Transition. The word sat in my gut like a stone. We had been transitioned from what we were to what we are now, and the transfer order, the one that moved us from Kallenthi to the Pallbearers subsector, to Drassenvol, to the warband, was part of that transition. Authorized, approved, planned. I sat with that for a long time, in the rubble of that bunker, with the distant sound of artillery and the closer sound of Tove arguing with someone about ammunition allotments. I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Not anger, not fear. Something colder and more corrosive. Understanding. It came together in pieces over the following weeks. I could not confirm everything because confirmation would require access to records that no longer existed or that were locked behind authority I did not have. But I did not need confirmation. The pieces fit too well for coincidence, and I had stopped believing in coincidence long before Drassenvol. The Kallenthi 206th did not fall to chaos on Drassenvol. The Kallenthi 206th was built to fall. Our regiment had been founded 80 years before I was born. Standard Tithe Regiment, raised from the population of Kallenthi Prime, trained at the Departmental Munitorum facility at Fort Cresval, and deployed to garrison duty on our homeworld, a nowhere unit doing nothing work on a nothing world. Except the founding was wrong. The tithe authorization came from the same source as the transfer order, the same unrecognizable authority with the same inhuman handwriting. Fort Cresval, where our officers were trained, had been decommissioned 20 years before the 206th was raised, which meant it was reactivated specifically for us, which meant someone wanted our officers trained in a specific way, in a specific place, for a specific purpose. The rations. The supply chain that fed the 206th for its entire existence ran through logistics nodes that were not standard Departmental Munitorum facilities. I could not trace the full chain, but the fragments I found pointed to sources outside the normal procurement network. Our food, the food I had eaten 3 times a day for 6 years on Kallenthi, came from somewhere that the Imperium did not control. And Colonel Heisler, the man who knelt first, the man who made the choice for all of us. Heisler had been the 206th's commanding officer for 14 years, transferred in from a regiment that had been destroyed in action. Except the regiment he came from, the Torveni 3rd, I found a reference to it in the Thendra garrison's intelligence archive. The Torveni 3rd was not destroyed in action. It was dissolved for suspected chaos contamination. Every member was executed. Every member except one officer who was reassigned to a newly formed garrison regiment on a quiet, remote world where nobody would look too closely. Colonel Hassler did not choose to surrender on Drassenvol. He had been planted in the 206th to ensure our surrender. The warp storm that cut us off was not random. The Pallbearers did not arrive by chance. We were not a regiment that fell. We were a regiment that was grown from the seed up as a harvest for chaos. Everything. The founding. The officers. The supply chain. The training. The posting. The storm. The surrender. All of it choreographed over 8 decades to produce 1,200 soldiers who would kneel in a muddy courtyard and give themselves to the pallbearers without a fight. I had never made a choice. None of us had. From the moment I was born on a world selected as a breeding ground for chaos-tainted soldiers, I had been a cultivation project. Stage 3. Transition authorized. I was Stage 3. We all were. I found Tova that night. He was in his bunk reading something by the light of a stolen lumen globe, and when he saw my face, he put the reading material down and waited. "You found that manifest 3 months ago," I said. "You knew about the cultivation program for 3 months, and you said nothing." He did not do the crooked smile, did not deflect, did not play the angle. He just looked at me with those mismatched eyes and waited for the rest. So I gave him the rest. All of it. Hessler, the Torveni 3rd, the forged founding documents, the decommissioned training facility, everything I had pieced together from the intelligence archive and the command bunker records. I laid it out the way you lay out a field report, methodical, precise, and when I was done, Tove was quiet for a long time. "I did not know all of that," he said. "Not the specifics. The manifest gave me the word, cultivation. It listed worlds and regiment designations, dozens of them, and it listed stages 1 through 5. Our regiment was at Stage 3. But I did not know about Hassler. I did not know about the founding." He paused. "What I knew was that the manifest listed compounds, dosage schedules, things that went into the ration supply, low-grade warp reactive agents, sub-threshold doses, things that open doors inside you that are supposed to stay closed. We ate them for years, Ossten, the entire regiment. I thought about 6 years of meals on Kallenthi. The nutrient bars I had always found slightly off, a metallic aftertaste I had attributed to poor manufacturing, and something crawled along the inside of my stomach that was close to nausea. There was something else, Tove said. The dreams. The manifest called Dream Pattern Synchronization a Stage 2 marker. The red corridor. The sound of bells. The door that would not open. Everyone in the regiment had the same dreams, the same ones. For years. Nobody ever talked about it, because talking about dreams is not something soldiers do, but we all had them. Synchronized dreaming meant the attunement was taking. It was a progress indicator. I had had them. The red corridor. I had dreamed it 100 times and never once thought to question why. "Why did you not tell me?" I asked. "Because I found that manifest 3 decks below where any human is supposed to go, in a section the Marines use for their own logistics. If they had found out I read it, I would have gone to the lower decks and not come back." He met my eyes. "And because it would not have changed anything, what would you have done? Where would you have gone?" He was right. Knowing changed nothing. I was still here, still alive, still commanding a platoon of damned souls in the service of a chaos warband that had owned me before I was born. I thought about Lieutenant O'Servin, who drew her sidearm and fought back on Drassenvol. I thought about Trooper Kennick, who ran for the walls, the ones who resisted. Were they exceptions? Or were they the ones on whom the cultivation did not take, the failed experiments, the crops that refused to grow in the direction they were planted? It did not matter. They were dead. I was alive. And alive in the service of the Pallbearers was the only state that still had options attached to it, however narrow and dark those options might be. I went back to work the next morning. Thendra was still contested. Shelek still expected results. The war did not care about what I had learned. I fought differently after that. Colder, more precise. The math had changed. The Imperium was not what I had been told it was, and neither was I, and the only thing left that was not a lie was the violence. So I leaned into it. Thendra fell. The garrison broke on the 58th day when Vortigris committed the possessed to the final assault, and the defensive lines collapsed in a cascade of madness and butchery that I will not describe in full because some things should not be given more weight through repetition. The final stronghold, a hardened bunker complex beneath the planet's capital, held out for another month before the sorcerers cracked it open from the inside. I do not know what they did. I heard it. That was enough. The subsector campaign continued. After Thendra, Horrifying, a shrine world where we burn temples, and I saw Tove drink from a chalice that had been consecrated to the Emperor and throw it into a fire pit while laughing. Dan Korth, a forge world where the Mechanicus defenders fought with a cold, mechanical tenacity that I almost admired, where the warband lost 8 Marines, which was a staggering number, and over 100 human auxiliaries, including 11 of my platoon. Dan Koreth was also where it happened again. The thing from the culvert on Athus Noval, the sense of knowing without seeing. Stronger this time and harder to explain away. We were moving through a transit corridor between 2 manufactorum complexes when I felt it. A pressure behind the eyes, like the onset of a headache that would not commit. And with the pressure came information. 2 Skitarii squads, 8 fighters each, in the service alcoves on either side of the corridor, 40 meters ahead. I knew their positions. I knew the one on the left would fire first. I halted the platoon and sent Drevik and 3 others through a maintenance hatch to flank the alcoves. When the ambush triggered, we were ready. The Skitarii died in a crossfire they had not anticipated, and Drevik looked at me with a question in his face that he was learning not to ask. I did not call it instinct this time. I did not call it anything. I noted it and moved on, the way you note a new pain in your body and choose not to investigate because you are afraid of what you might find. Somewhere in the campaigns after Thendra, the shrine fires of Horrifying, the forge dark of Dana Koreth, I lost the last traces of faith I had not realized I was still carrying. And on the transport out of Dan Koreth, I woke up one morning and realized I had lost something else. Fear. Fear had been the constant. Fear of the Marines, the demons, the changes, the lower decks, the background radiation of my existence. And then it was gone. Not suppressed. Not managed. Gone. I lay in my bunk listening to the engines grind through the warp and felt no dread, no recoil at the things scratching against the hull from the other side. Just a vast, clean, empty silence where the fear used to be. I told Tove. He nodded as if he had expected it. The 4th wall coming down, he called it, something Velundrin preached. The Dark Apostle taught that there are 4 barriers between a mortal soul and the warp. The first wall is faith. The second is identity. The third is revulsion. The 4th is fear. When the fourth wall falls, you are open. Open to what? I asked. He did not answer. He just smiled. Not the crooked smile. Something newer. Something that showed too many teeth. Then Golvass 2, a dead world where there was nothing to fight but the planet itself, where the ground opened and the air turned to acid, and the sky wept something that burned through flak armor in minutes, and the sorcerers walked through it all untouched, harvesting something from the planet's mantle that they would not name. The changes accelerated through all of it. My fingernails turned black, the keratin dense and dark and slightly curved, like claws that had not yet committed to the shape. The mole on my arm was gone entirely, and in its place was a patch of skin smooth and featureless and slightly cooler than the surrounding tissue, as if whatever grew there had not yet decided what to be. My teeth were heavier in my jaw, anchored differently, and when I ran my tongue over them in the dark, I could feel ridges that had not been there a month ago. I went to see Hallish, the closest thing the human auxiliaries had to a medici, though his expertise was less in healing than in telling which mutations were functional and which were terminal. He was a born cultist who had never known anything but the warband. His own mutations were extensive. His left arm ended in 3 fingers, each as long as my forearm and tipped with chitin, and his right eye was twice the size of his left and saw, he claimed, into spectrums of light that had no names. To Hallish, the warp was not a corruption of the natural order. It was the natural order. He examined me with the oversized eye, turning my hands over, peeling back my lips, pressing his long fingers against the blank patch on my arm, making small sounds the way a craftsman does when assessing materials. "You are changing well," he said finally. "I did not know there was a well and a poorly." "There is. Poorly is when the body fights it, when the flesh rejects what is coming, and the result is pain and deformity and collapse. You have seen the spawn." He gestured toward the lower decks where the Chaos spawn were kept, former humans and marines whose mutations had spiraled beyond any coherent form. Now, masses of flesh and limb and screaming mouths used as shock weapons in the worst engagements. That is the body saying no, and the warp saying yes, and the argument destroying everything in between. And well is when the body says yes too, when it opens and lets the change move through it like water through sand. He looked at me with that enormous eye, and for a moment I saw something in it that might have been envy. "You are changing well, Ossten. Whatever is coming for you, your flesh is ready for it. Whatever is coming for you." I did not like the phrasing. It implied direction, purpose, a destination that my body was traveling toward, while the rest of me sat in the passenger seat and watched the landscape change. I asked Halleck if he knew what the destination was. He said he did not, but that Shellek might, because Shellek watched me in a way that suggested he was waiting for something specific. I asked Halleck what he meant by that, and he made a sound that was not quite a laugh and said, "You do not notice it because you are not looking at yourself from the outside. But Shellek watches you the way a farmer watches a crop, checking the growth, measuring the progress, waiting for the harvest." There was that word again. Harvest. Cultivation and harvest. I was still the crop. I had simply been transplanted from one field to another. The 9th campaign was Osviel, a hive world, population in the billions. The Pallbearers hit it not as a conquest, but as a raid, a surgical strike to extract something from the planet's primary hive. I did not know what the objective was. Humans rarely did. My platoon was assigned to the cordon, hold the perimeter around the extraction zone while the Marines went in. Standard work. Except the extraction zone was deep in the Underhive, in a district the local star had not touched in centuries, and the defenders were not PDF. They were Adeptus Arbites, the Imperium's enforcers of law, hard men and women in carapace armor, with the disciplined institutional fury of an organization that believes, without reservation, that it is righteous. They hit us on the second day. A counterattack through the access tunnels, well organized and savage in the way that only the truly faithful can be. We lost 9 in the first exchange. I lost Trooper Marevk, who had been with me since Athus Noval and survived 6 campaigns by being unremarkable in every way except his reliability. A shotgun blast took his legs and he fell screaming into the dark, and I did not go back for him, because going back would have compromised the position, and the position mattered more than one man. The Arbites pressed us. They were better than any Imperial force I had fought since the turn, and my platoon was being pushed back, the line starting to bend toward breaking. And then something happened. The thing from the culvert on Athus Noval, the thing from the transit corridor on Dan Korath. But not a whisper this time, not a nudge, a detonation. In that moment, with the Arbites closing in, and my platoon dying, and the noise of combat filling the tunnel until it was a solid thing, a wall of sound pressing against my skull, the pressure behind my eyes that I had been ignoring for months tore open, not like a door, like a wound. It opened like a valve, and through it poured something that was not thought and not instinct and not adrenaline but something else entirely. I knew where they were. The Arbites. All of them. Not saw, not heard, not inferred from tactical analysis. Knew. The way you know where your own hands are without looking. 16 of them in the main tunnel, 4 in the side passage flanking left, 2 above us in a maintenance conduit preparing grenades. I knew their positions, and I knew their intentions, and I knew, with a certainty that had no source I could name, that the 2 in the conduit were going to drop frag grenades in exactly 4 seconds. I shouted the warning, moved 3 of my people out of the blast zone. The grenades dropped. They killed 2 cultists who were not fast enough, but the rest of us were clear, and I was already directing fire into the side passage where the flankers were, and my squad was moving before they understood why, but they moved because I told them to, and they had learned to trust my calls. We broke the counterattack, killed or routed 22 Arbites in a tunnel fight that should have gone the other way. And when it was over and the tunnel was quiet, except for the moaning of the wounded and the drip of fluids I chose not to identify, I stood in the dark and felt that space behind my eyes slowly close, like a door easing shut, and I understood what Halech had meant. Whatever is coming for you. It was a gift, a genuine one, not the mocking blessings of the dark gods that twist and disfigure, but a functional enhancement, a new sense grafted onto my existing ones. I could feel it settling into me, integrating with my nervous system, becoming part of the baseline the way the sharper teeth and the black nails had. Not forced. Given. Shelek reached me 20 minutes later. He walked through the tunnel where the Arbites bodies lay cooling, and he looked at the tactical spread, at the positions of the dead and the pattern of the engagement, and he understood immediately what had happened. Those amber lenses fixed on me with an intensity I had not seen before, and for the first time he spoke more than a terse instruction. "How long?" he asked. I did not pretend to misunderstand. How long since I started feeling it? Since the edges of something had begun pressing against the inside of my skull, since the dreams had changed from the red corridor to a thing that was newer, that felt less like vision and more like memory? "Weeks," I said. "Maybe months." "I do not know when it started." He was quiet. Then he reached out with one gauntleted hand and placed it on my shoulder, and the weight of it nearly buckled my knees, not because it was heavy, but because of what came through the contact. A pulse, a resonance, something that traveled from his hand through my body and lit up the space behind my eyes like a flare in a dark room, and for one fraction of a second I saw him. Not the armor, not the helm. Him. What was underneath? What was behind the amber lenses? Pain. 10,000 years of it, layered and compressed and calcified into something that was not quite madness, but was no longer sanity either. And beneath the pain, a vast, patient calculation, a mind that had been running the same equation for millennia and had finally, on a battlefield beneath a hive world, found its answer. He took his hand away. I gasped. The tunnel swam back into focus. "Good," he said, the same word he had used on Drassenvol. But this time it meant something different. This time it meant, "I have been waiting for you." He left without another word. I stood among the dead Arbites and the remnants of my platoon, and the certainty settled over me that the thing inside me was not a disease or a curse or a punishment. It was a purpose, and I had spent 3 years marching toward it without knowing it was there. The Oswial extraction was completed 6 hours later. The Marines emerged from the underhive carrying something wrapped in chains and void seals, something that hummed at a frequency I could feel in my fillings and that made the blank patch on my arm itch furiously. We left the planet behind, burning from the inside out, the underhive collapsing into sinkholes as whatever the sorcerers had done took hold. I watched a billion-soul hive world fold in on itself, and I felt the space behind my eyes pulse in sympathy. Shelek summoned me 3 days into the warp transit, not to his command station where he usually received reports from the human officers, to his private quarters. In 3 years, no human had been invited to that section of the ship. The corridors leading to it were lined with carvings that moved when you were not looking directly at them, and the air had a thickness, a weight, like trying to breathe underwater. His quarters were Spartan, a weapon rack, an armor stand, a table that might have been wood or bone, and across it, spread like a surgeon's instruments, objects I could not identify. Crystals, vials of liquid that glowed in colors I had no names for, thin metal instruments etched with sigils, and at the center a physical book bound in leather, too smooth and too warm, with pages that whispered when you came near. "Sit," Shelek said, and I sat. Because when a chosen of the Pallbearers tells you to sit, you do not ask for a reason. He removed his gauntlets. I had never seen his hands before. They were massive, as all Astartes' hands are, but scarred in patterns that were too regular to be the result of combat. Ritual scarring, lines and whorls and intersecting geometries that covered every surface of skin from fingertip to wrist, and in the dim light of his quarters they seemed to shift, to realign themselves as if the patterns were not fixed but fluid. He placed both hands flat on the table and looked at me with those amber lenses and spoke. "The Kallenthi 206th was not unique," he said. I waited. He let the silence stretch, the way a man lets a blade cool before he draws it across the whetstone again. The Pallbearers have been running similar programs on dozens of worlds across the sector for centuries, generations-long operations, seeding populations with sub-threshold warp-reactive compounds, manipulating breeding patterns through controlled environmental factors, engineering the slow and patient emergence of a specific psychic phenotype. "The Thendra garrison," I said, "the stamp on their rations, same program." He nodded once. "Then Drassenvol, Veldor, Kranthis, Pelondre. Others you have never heard of. The Imperium produces psychers by the millions, but the Imperium's psychers are attuned to the warp as an undifferentiated force. They are claimed by whatever god reaches them first, or they are consumed by the warp's raw energy. They are not what we need. What do you need? Balance. The compounds in the rations, the controlled environment, the generational exposure to all four aspects of chaos simultaneously, balanced and measured with a precision that has taken centuries to refine. It produces psychers who resonate not with one god, not with the warp as a whole, but with all four chaos gods equally and simultaneously. A balanced conduit, a nexus point where all four streams of power can flow without one overwhelming the others. I stared at him. Dozens of worlds, he had said, centuries, generations. How many survived? I asked. How many conduits? This is impossibly rare, Shelek said, and his tone shifted in a way that might have been an acknowledgement of cost. The gods are jealous. Each seeks to claim every soul that opens to the warp. The natural state of a mortal psyker is to be consumed by one power, or torn apart between them. But a psyker cultivated from birth, whose genetics have been shaped to hold equilibrium across all four frequencies, can become what the gods rarely allow: a neutral conduit, a point of convergence. He paused, picked up one of the crystals from the table and held it up. And in its facets I saw light that did not come from any source in the room. You are that conduit, Ossten. You are what 80 years of cultivation produced. Not the only candidate. There were others across other regiments, other worlds. Most did not survive the awakening. Their minds shattered when four gods tried to speak through them at once. He set the crystal down. In 3 centuries of cultivation, across all the worlds in the program, 4 conduits have awakened successfully. 2 burned out during the ritual. 1 was claimed by Slaanesh at the moment of convergence and had to be destroyed. The 4th served us for 11 years before his body failed. 4 in 3 centuries. The mathematics of that investment, the sheer patience of it, the thousands of human lives that had been bred and fed and monitored and ultimately discarded in the process of finding 4 usable instruments, was staggering. The Imperium thought in terms of decades. The Pallbearers thought in terms of ages. You are the 5th, Shelek said, and you are the strongest. Your awakening was the cleanest I have observed. No fragmentation, no drift toward a single patron. The fourfold current flows through you as if you were built for it. He paused, which of course you were. My parents, their parents, generations of them, selected and matched and monitored and fed the right compounds, all to produce a child whose blood carried the potential for something that should not exist. Why? I said. The word came out flat. Why do you need a conduit? A Chaos Undivided warband draws power from all 4 gods, Shelek said. But the gods give reluctantly to those who do not give exclusively in return. A warband that pledges to one receives that god's full blessing. A warband that pledges to all receives a fraction from each, and the fractions are unstable, pulling against each other, creating schisms. You have seen the infighting. The Cornate devotees and the Tsientkian sorcerers and the rest, all nominally united under Vortigris, but each pulling toward their own patron. I had seen it. The internal tensions of the Pallbearers were a constant undercurrent, managed by Vortigris's authority, but never resolved. The tolerance between Marines of different inclinations was brittle. A conduit changes the equation, Shelek continued. A living nexus through which all 4 streams flow in balance can be the center of a ritual that stabilizes the warband's connection to all 4 gods. Not a permanent solution, a surge, a moment of perfect alignment when the full power of Chaos Undivided can be channeled without fragmentation. In battle, that moment is worth more than 1,000 Marines. A moment. He was talking about using me as a battery, a living transformer, converting the raw, contradictory power of 4 rival gods into something the warband could wield. "And after the moment?" I asked. "What happens to the conduit?" He did not answer immediately. He set the crystal down and placed his scarred hands flat on the table again, and the patterns on his skin shifted into a configuration I had not seen before, something that looked almost like a face. "That depends on the conduit," he said. "Some burn out. The power is too much and the body simply ceases. Others are consumed by one god, the balance tipping at the last moment and the conduit claimed as a prize. And some," he said, and his voice dropped into a register that felt like pressure against the inside of my skull, "some survive. Some hold the balance and come through, changed but intact. The gods reward those who can bear their combined attention without breaking, not with demonhood, with something rarer, a permanent connection to the undivided current that makes the conduit more than human, more than psyker, something the warp has no word for." He looked at me. "I have been watching you for 3 years," he said. "I have put you in positions designed to accelerate your awakening. The commands, the battles, the proximity to concentrated warp phenomena. Every assignment calibrated to push you toward the threshold without pushing you over it. And you responded correctly every time. Not because you are strong, though you are, because you are what you were made to be. The cultivation worked. You are the harvest." There it was. 3 years of telling myself I was making choices, adapting, enduring. I had not been doing any of those things. I had been ripening. And the most terrible thing, I did not want to refuse. The power I had felt on Ossten, the moment in the tunnel when the valve opened, and I knew where every enemy stood before they moved. That had been the most alive I had felt since before Drassenvol. More alive than anything. I wanted it back. I wanted to open that valve again and let the fourfold current run through me. Korn's red fury, Tzeentch's crystalline whispers, Nurgle's deep warmth, Slanesh's razor-edged ecstasy. All of it braided into something that no single god could offer. The cultivation made me capable of hearing it. But the wanting was mine, the only thing in my entire existence that had not been put there by someone else. "Yes," I said. Shelek nodded, not surprised. He had known what I would say before I said it, probably since Drassenvol, since the moment I knelt in the mud and chose survival over everything else. "There will be a ritual," he said, "on the next world. Vortigris will lead it. You will stand at the center. The sorcerers will open the channels, and you will hold them. All 4, simultaneously, for as long as you can. The campaign will be decided in that moment, and if I burn out, then we will cultivate another," he said. "It will take decades, but we are patient." I left his quarters and went back to my platoon. Tove was waiting, because Tove was always waiting, and when he saw my face, he knew. He did not ask what Shelek had told me. He put his hand on my arm and said, "Welcome home, Ossten." And the worst part was that it felt like one. During the 4 days of warp transit to the target world, the gift grew. Not in sudden leaps, but in steady increments, like a lens focusing by degrees. On the first day, I could only sense positions, the spatial awareness from Ossten. By the second day, I began to perceive something else, emotional textures. I passed a group of cultists and felt their collective anxiety like a cold draft. I sat across from Brevin Thule in the mess hall and sensed his weariness, a deep gray exhaustion that had nothing to do with his body. When a sorcerer walked past the human quarters, I felt his mind like a furnace, burning and alien and structured in ways that made my new sense recoil. It frightened me. Not the ability, but the intimacy of it. To sense where someone stands is tactical. To sense what someone feels is a violation. and I could not turn it off. I lay in my bunk on the third night and felt the dreams of the people sleeping around me pressing against my awareness, each with a flavor, a temperature. I knew without wanting to know that the woman below me was dreaming of her children, and that Tove, sleeping with his back to me, was dreaming of nothing at all. The absence was somehow louder than all the rest. By the fourth day, when the ship shuddered out of the warp, I had accepted the new sense the way I had accepted the black nails and the sharp teeth. Another change. The difference was that this one was useful, and in the economy of the Pallbearers, useful things survive. We reached the target world that same day. Gheskren, a cardinal world, seat of the subsector's ecclesiarchal authority. Cathedrals the size of mountains, choirs of 10,000 voices singing hymns that could be heard from orbit. A population so saturated in faith that the planet's psychic presence in the warp was a bonfire visible for light years, a declaration of loyalty to the corpse throne that was an insult Vortigris could not abide, and an opportunity the sorcerers could not resist. A cardinal world's faith is not just symbolic, it is a psychic reality. The collective belief of billions generates a resonance that strengthens the barrier between real space and the warp. To crack that barrier, you need a force strong enough to overwhelm the faith. Or you need to corrupt it from within, to turn it from a shield into a beacon, from a wall into a door. That was what the conduit was for. That was what I was for. We made planet fall on the 8th day. The Sororitas garrison fought us from the moment the drop pods split the sky, sisters of battle in pearl-white armor, their faith made manifest in martial prowess that bordered on the superhuman, bolters roaring hymns and blades wreathed in golden light. They killed a dozen of my platoon in the first hour. They killed Halleck, my mutant medici, cut in half by a Sister Superior's power sword as he tried to drag a wounded cultist clear. They fought as if the Emperor himself was watching, and perhaps he was. But the Pallbearers were ancient and strong, and even thinned by the subsector campaign, they fielded 50 traitor marines, and a dozen possessed, and a sorcerer cabal that had been preparing for months. We pushed through the outer defenses into the cathedral districts, past statues of saints that wept blood as we passed. Tove died on the second day. A stray bolt round from a retreating Sororitas squad caught him in the chest, and he went down hard and fast, the way soldiers die when there is nothing dramatic about it. I reached him before the end. His mismatched eyes found mine, and he tried to say something, but the blood in his throat turned it into a whisper I could not decipher. He gripped my wrist with a hand stronger than it should have been, the changes having given him strength as they had given me. And in the last moment before his eyes went empty, I felt the space behind my own flare, and I heard, through the new sense, his final thought. Not a word, not an image, a feeling, relief. The kind that comes when a long and terrible noise finally stops, and the silence is the most beautiful sound you have ever heard. He was glad to die. After the turn, the campaigns, the violence, the years of being a cog in a machine designed by gods, he was glad it was over. I closed his eyes, took his ammunition, kept moving. The ritual was on the third day. The sorcerers had identified the focal point, the grand cathedral of the Radiant Throne, the oldest place of worship on Gheskren, its central nave large enough to house an imperial battleship standing on its end. The defenders had pulled back to it for their last stand, the remaining sisters and civilians barricading behind walls 3 meters thick, and singing, always singing, their faith a physical force that pushed against the advance like a wind. The Pallbearers broke through at dawn. The possessed went first, screaming things that split reality at the edges, and behind them the Marines in their full, terrible splendor, and behind them us, the mortals, the meat, pouring through the breaches. I walked through the cathedral in the wake of the carnage. The pews were shattered, the icons burning, the great stained glass windows blown inward, their fragments scattered across the marble like a kaleidoscope of broken faith. Sisters in their ruined white armor lay sprawled across the nave like fallen angels, their faces locked in expressions of defiance that death had not softened. At the center, where the altar stood beneath a dome painted with the Emperor's ascension, the sorcerers had prepared the circle. Wards and sigils in substances I could not identify, candles that burned with no flame, crystals that sang at frequencies that made my teeth ache. And set at the circle's edge, its void seals broken open at last, the thing the Marines had hauled out of the Ossten underhive in chains. Leaking a cold that pressed against the skin like deep water, the blank patch on my arm, itching in answer to it. Whatever the raid had been for, it had been for this. And at the very center of it all, a space. Empty. Waiting. For me. Vortigris was there. Standing at the edge of the circle, his bare face turned upward toward the painted dome, his eyes reflecting the burning icons. He looked at me as I approached, and his mouth moved, shaping a word I could not hear, and the space behind my eyes erupted in light so bright that for a moment I was blind, and in the blindness I heard 4 voices speaking simultaneously, each one distinct, each one vast beyond comprehension, and each one saying the same thing in a different language. Yes. I stepped into the circle. The sorcerers began their chanting. 8 of them arranged around the circle in 4 pairs, each pair given over to one of the 4 gods, with 2 more standing apart from the rest to anchor the working. Their voices were not human, not anymore. The sounds were in languages that predated the species that birthed them, syllables spoken in the warp before Terra cooled from molten rock. And each syllable was a key turning in a lock, and behind each lock was a god. I felt them open, one by one. 4 doors, 4 presences, 4 vast and terrible intelligences turning their attention toward a single point in a defiled cathedral on a burning cardinal world. Khorne came first. Not gently. Khorne does nothing gently. It was a red wave, a tsunami of rage and bloodlust that slammed into me through the first door and filled every vessel in my body with a heat that was not temperature but fury. Pure and distilled, the fury of 10,000 battlefields and 1 billion screaming throats. My vision went red, my hands curled into fists, and I felt the black nails dig into my palms and draw blood, and the blood steamed as it hit the air. Tzeentch came second. Blue and silver and fractal, a cascade of knowledge and possibility that poured through the second door and unfolded inside my skull like an origami structure becoming infinitely complex. I saw patterns in the broken glass on the floor, in the smoke curling from the burning icons, in the arrangement of the bodies of the fallen sisters. Patterns within patterns, each one containing information that would take a human lifetime to parse, and all of it available to me in a single crystalline instant of comprehension. Nurgle came third, warm, a warmth that was not comfort but endurance, the warmth of a body that refuses to die, of flesh that rots and regenerates at once, of a love so vast and so patient that it encompasses everything, including the things that should not be loved. Decay and growth intertwined, and within the cycle a peace so profound that I nearly wept. Slaanesh came last, and Slaanesh nearly destroyed me. If Khorne was a tsunami, and Tzeentch a crystal, and Nurgle a warmth, then Slaanesh was a blade drawn across the skin of my consciousness, a sensation so acute it transcended the boundary between pleasure and agony. Every nerve fired at once. Every memory I had ever formed replayed in a single instant, stripped to pure sensation, and it was unbearable, and I wanted more of it, wanted it to cut all the way through. 4 gods, 4 streams of power, 4 incompatible, mutually hostile forces flowing through a single mortal body, bred across generations for exactly this purpose. The pain was beyond description, but so was the clarity. I held them. All 4, the way I had been made to. They pulled at me, each one whispering its own version of eternity, and I held them in balance the way a man holds a weight above his head, not through strength but through alignment, finding the exact center where the forces cancel, and the only thing left is the trembling equilibrium of 4 gods. The sorcerers channeled through me. I felt the power leave my body through channels I had not known existed, flowing into the stones of the cathedral, into the bones of the planet, into the warp, where it became a signal, a beacon, a frequency that was not corns or tzinches or nurgles or slaneshes, but all of them, a chord of 4 impossible notes harmonizing for the first time since the gods were born from the dreams of mortals. The Pallbearers felt it. I could feel them. Every Marine in the warband, their bodies resonating with the signal like tuning forks struck by a single hammer. Their unity, always fragile, always contested, locked into place with an almost audible click. For that one stretched and infinite moment, they were not a collection of rivalrous fanatics under a shared banner. They were one weapon, aimed at the galaxy with the focused malice of 4 gods acting in concert. It lasted 4 minutes. I know because someone told me afterward. In the moment, it could have been seconds or centuries. Time does not function inside the 4-fold current, but from the outside it was 4 minutes. 4 minutes during which the warp tore open above Gheskren, and something poured through that was not a demon and not a storm, but a presence, the combined gaze of 4 gods falling on a single world and finding it wanting. The faith broke, not the people, the faith itself. The psychic barrier that the collective worship of billions had maintained, the wall between Gheskren and the warp, cracked along its length and the raw immaterium flooded through. The defenders did not simply die. That would have been clean, and the warp does not do clean. I was not conscious for the aftermath, but the picture I assembled from the accounts of those who were is worse than death. Some collapsed where they stood, minds snuffed out like candle flames. The fortunate ones. Others went mad. Sisters of battle turned their bolters on their own squads, screaming prayers that came out wrong, the words twisting mid-syllable into invocations of the gods they had spent their lives opposing. PDF troopers clawed at their own faces, trying to dig out something they could feel growing behind their eyes. A priest climbed a bell tower and threw himself from it, laughing the entire way down. Some kept fighting, their faith shattered but their training holding, and the pallbearers had to crush each pocket individually, wading through defenders who fought with the unhinged ferocity of the truly doomed. The fighting lasted another 6 hours, but the outcome was decided in those 4 minutes. Without the faith that had made it a fortress, the world was just meat. When the 4 doors slammed shut and the circle broke and the power drained out of me like water from a cracked vessel, I was still standing. Barely. My nose was bleeding. My ears were bleeding. The blank patch on my arm had split open, and something was moving beneath it, dark and articulated, a limb or a tendril that had no name, and it pulsed in time with my heartbeat before retracting and the skin closing over it as if it had never been. I did not burn out. I did not break. I survived. Skelak was the first to reach me. He caught me as my legs gave out and lowered me to the blood-stained marble, and for the first and only time he removed his helm, and I saw his face. It was a space marine's face, broad and hard and scarred beyond recognition, with eyes that had seen 10 millennia of war and had long ago stopped processing what they saw as horror. But in that moment, looking down at me, there was something in those ancient eyes that I had not expected. Respect. "You held," he said. "I held," I said. He put the helm back on, the amber lenses glowed. The moment passed. The aftermath of Gheskren was a blur of consolidation and extraction. The warband stripped the cardinal world of everything useful, relics and weapons and supplies and prisoners, and withdrew to the warp before the Imperial Navy could respond. I spent 3 days in something that was not quite sleep and not quite unconsciousness, a state where the space behind my eyes expanded and contracted in slow waves, and the fourfold current whispered through me in diminishing echoes, like the vibrations of a bell long after it has been struck. When I woke, I was different, not in the dramatic, visible way. No new limbs, no horns or wings. The changes were internal. The world looked sharper, more detailed. I could perceive the warp as a constant background presence, a shimmering field overlaid on reality. And I could still hear the echo of the 4 voices, distant now but never entirely silent, a quartet of whispers at the edge of perception that was sometimes maddening and always present. Vortigris acknowledged me, not with words, with a nod. A single downward motion of that ruined head delivered across the command deck of his flagship before his chosen and his sorcerers and the full complement of his traitor marines. A nod that meant, "You have been seen, you have been measured, you have been found sufficient." I was not promoted. There is no rank for what I became. But the warband treated me differently. The Marines did not step around me anymore. They acknowledged me the way they acknowledged each other, with the flat, neutral register of beings who recognize a fellow predator. The human auxiliaries looked at me with something between awe and terror, and I could not blame them because I looked at them and saw not faces, but auras, and I knew which of them would last and which would break and which would burn like Drenner in a blaze of pointless devotion. Brevin Thule said it aloud in the mess hall, his waxy scar gleaming in the dim light. "You are not one of us anymore." I knew what he meant. Not one of the humans, not one of the Marines either. Something the cultivation had produced and the ritual had forged, and the 4 gods had in their terrifying way endorsed. A weapon. A conduit that could be used again and again, each time stronger, each time more distant from the man who had knelt in a muddy courtyard on Drassenvol, because he could not think of anything better to choose. The next campaign came 5 weeks later. A fortress world called Delvrin Bastion. Imperial Guard garrison, 2 full regiments, dug in behind void shields and orbital defenses. A hard target. Vortigris committed the full warband. I led the human assault. Not as a corporal, not as a platoon leader, but as what I was. The conduit. The thing that stood between the mortal soldiers and the traitor Marines, and translated power into action. The fourfold current flowed through me as I advanced, not at the intensity of the ritual, but a lower, sustained frequency, enough to sharpen my senses and project a field of something, call it dread, that made the enemy flinch and made my own people fight harder than they had any right to. We breached the outer walls in 6 hours. The guard fell back to the inner fortifications, and on the 2nd day, in the rubble of a shelled command post, I found him. An Imperial commissar, wounded, his bolt pistol empty, his chainsword broken at the hilt, his great coat torn and soaked with blood that was mostly not his own. He was sitting against a wall with his legs crushed beneath a fallen beam, and when I came through the smoke, he looked up at me with eyes that were bright with pain and defiance and the unshakable incandescent faith that is the commissariat's stock in trade. He saw my equipment first, the mix of Imperial and Chaos gear that every human auxiliary wears, the 8-pointed star scratched into my shoulder guard, the modifications to my flak armor that no Imperial armorer would recognize. Then he saw something else. I watched his eyes track downward to my chest plate, to a marking I had never bothered to remove because it had ceased to mean anything to me. The regimental numeral of the Kallenthi 206th stamped into the lower right corner of my cuirass the way all our armor had been stamped at Fort Cressfall. His expression changed. Not comprehension, recognition, not of me, of the marking. 206, he said. His voice was thick with blood and something else. Disbelief. Kallenthi. His jaw worked. I was on the tribunal when the Pallbearers garrisons went dark. I was on the board of inquiry. We listed you as destroyed. 1,200 souls lost to enemy action on Drassenval. He looked at me the way you look at a grave that has opened itself. We gave your names to the rolls of the honored dead. I signed the commendation myself. He had mourned my regiment. This stranger, pinned under rubble on a world I had come to destroy, had sat on a tribunal. Commissars rotated through the subsector's boards of inquiry as readily as through its firing lines, and given us, in the bureaucratic language of the Imperium, the dignity of a clean death in the Emperor's service. And here I stood, alive, corrupted, the 8-pointed star on my shoulder and 4 gods humming behind my eyes, the living refutation of every word he had written. You were honored, he said, and his voice cracked on the word. You were mourned. Families on Kallenthi were told their sons and daughters died defending the Imperium. He stared at me. Was any of it true? Did any of you fight? Some did, I said. They died first. He closed his eyes, opened them. The defiance was still there, but underneath it was something raw, something that the fourfold current let me perceive as a texture. Grief, not for himself, for the lie I had just confirmed, for 1,200 names on a roll of honor that were not martyrs but livestock. The Emperor sees you, he said, quietly, not as a curse, as a statement of fact, delivered by a man who still believed it with every cell in his dying body. I stood over him and I searched myself for something. Guilt, shame, regret, anything. I found nothing. Not emptiness like after Athus Noval. Fullness, the fourfold current singing in me like blood, like breath, filling every space where guilt might have lived. The person who would have deserved that commendation was a mask I had worn over something real, and the real thing was standing in the rubble with 4 gods whispering in its ears. The Emperor does not see me, I said. I do not think he ever did. I believed it. That was the worst part. I believed it utterly, without reservation, without the faintest tremor of doubt. I drew my sidearm. The commissar did not close his eyes. He stared at me until the end, and in the last instant, through the gift, through the sense that the cultivation had awakened and the ritual had refined, I felt his faith, burning, defiant, unbroken even in the face of death, and tangled through it like a dark thread in bright cloth, the grief for 1,200 names that had never been what he thought they were. I pulled the trigger. The body settled. The faith winked out. I holstered the weapon and turned and walked back to my platoon, and the warp whispered at the edges of my perception. 4 voices braided into one, and the one voice said nothing, because it did not need to. I was already listening. My name is Ossten Grael. I was a corporal. I was a soldier. I was a loyal subject of the God Emperor of mankind, born and bred on Kallenthi Prime, trained in the arts of war, and committed to the defense of the Imperium of man. Every word of that is true, and none of it matters. I am the conduit. I am the nexus. I am the harvest of 80 years of patient cultivation. the product of a breeding program that spanned generations, the living proof that chaos does not need to conquer the human soul. It only needs to grow one from the right seed, in the right soil, with the right amount of light. I never fell. I was planted, and I have bloomed.